The Gilgo Beach Murders was one of those serial killing sprees that had forever cold case written all over it. It was one of the mysteries around serial murders that fascinated me for a long time, alongside some of the most, I don't want to say iconic cases, but you know what I mean. The West Mesa Bone Collector, Zodiac, Highway of Tears, and a handful of others that I'm afraid to say will probably go unsolved forever. Gilgo Beach was just one of those items on my long list of unsolved murders that caused an itch every time I looked into it. It was just so cocky, so out in the open, like this guy wanted to rub it in people's faces. When I heard that there was an arrest after all these years, I just about fell out of my chair, horrified and elated at the same time. Like there's a sense of celebration that this monster was finally off the street, that these women and their families could finally get the justice that they deserved, but there's also this sense of dumbfounded shock at how incredibly ordinary the killer was. This is why I don't talk to my neighbors. Just look at this guy. He could be anyone's neighbor, sitting next to you on the subway. Hell, he could be the guy teaching your kid chemistry. But before we look into Rex Heuermann, let's start this from the top in 2010 when the first grisly discovery was made. Let's get into it. It started with the disappearance of Shannan Gilbert, a 24-year-old escort who was out with a client on May the 10th of 2010. At 4:51 a.m., Shannan called 911, saying that someone was after her. Shortly after that, she was seen banging on doors of a residential neighborhood, begging for help. But before 911 or any of the homeowners could help her, she ran off into the night, never to be seen again. In the months police spent searching for Shannan, they happened to let out some search dogs in a marshy area in Ocean Parkway, which is located right next to Gilgo Beach.
Could it be a new twist in the Gilgo Beach Murders investigation, where search teams are looking now? And that is where we begin at 6.
According to an NYPD spokesman, Suffolk law enforcement officials had asked for the help because of the size of the area they wanted to search. As for the reason for this search, a law enforcement source familiar with the operation confirms this is all part of the Gilgo murder investigation. But neither Suffolk police nor the county DA would confirm that today. We also don't know why Manorville was targeted for this search, but we do know that the partial remains of 2 Gilgo victims, Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, were found here in Manorville before being located near Gilgo Beach 14 years ago. As you guys said, the scene today resembled that search 14 years ago when 10 sets of human remains were eventually found. Former New York City architect Rex Heuermann has been charged with 4 of those murders.
Only it wasn't Shannan the officer found, it was Melissa Bartholomew, another missing woman who disappeared in 2009. Melissa, just like Shannan, also did escort work on the side. Already there was a pattern here. Blue, the cadaver dog, went on to locate 4 bodies in total in the next few days. These 4 women were all wrapped in burlap sacks and all were found around the Gilgo Beach area. They were a 25-year-old mother of 2, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who went missing in 2007, Megan Waterman, missing since 2010, and Amberlynn Costello, 27 years old and last seen in 2010. The women all advertised their services on Craigslist, and all of them vanished after going out to meet a client. From some of their close friends who got a look at the client, it became apparent that the same man picked up a lot of these women before they went missing. Police got a description of a very tall white man with a thick head of hair and who was thought to be middle-aged. This was now officially a serial killer, and they hadn't even searched the whole area or found Shannan, who they'd originally been looking for. But Gilgo Beach still had more bodies hidden in its tall grasses. Next came Jessica Taylor, another 20-year-old escort. Jessica had been missing since 2003, but she was a little different from the rest. 3 days after she'd gone missing, Jessica's torso was found, wrapped in plastic and displayed on a slab of wood. Whoever had killed her obviously wanted her to be found. There was a single brown hair found tucked in a fold in the plastic that she was wrapped in. But despite having a perfect DNA sample of the killer, the case remained a mystery until the rest of her remains were found wrapped in a burlap sack in 2010, along with the other victims. Next came 24-year-old Valerie Mack, who went unidentified until very recently, and given her transient life, she was never even filed as a missing person. Her torso was found 45 miles away from Gilgo Beach in the summer of 2000, and given that the torso was in the early stages of decomposition, it's safe to assume that that was the time that she was killed. The next victim is only listed as Asian male. He was found wearing woman's clothes, so the prevailing theory is that he was a transgender escort, and when the killer discovered that the escort he'd hired was not a biological woman, it resulted in an unusually violent attack. John Doe was bludgeoned to death, while the others had no discernible outward trauma that would explain how they died. The assumption was always that the majority of the women were strangled to death. John Doe could have been anywhere between 17 and 23 years old, and the wet conditions of the marsh made the time of death very hard to determine. He could have died anywhere between 2001 and 2006. The discovery of Tanya Denise Jackson was an especially hard one because her 2-year-old daughter Tatiana was found in the same area. Tanya and Tatiana were thought to be unrelated to the Gilgo victims at first because they weren't wrapped in burlap and because they disappeared in 1997, which was at first thought to predate the serial killings. Not to mention that there's no evidence that the Army veteran ever worked as an escort. But Tanya's torso was also found separately from her and her daughter's remains, having been dumped 10 miles away in Hempstead Lake State Park. And that's congruent with the killer's MO. Then came Karen Vargata, 34, missing since 1996. Her torso was also found in a different location. Shannan was eventually located in December of 2011, 19 months after her disappearance. She was in the same stretch of marshland connected to Gilgo Beach, though she was found several miles away from the rest of the bodies. Investigators are still unwilling to declare Shannan as one of Heuermann's victims because there's a possibility that she might have drowned. But given her frantic 911 calls, the location she was found in, the fact that she was an escort, and her physical description, I personally think that Shannan was one of the victims too. I mean, how many coincidences do you need, man? But unless we get a confession or some evidence gets unearthed to prove otherwise, Shannan isn't officially listed as a Gilgo Beach victim for the time being. These are the official victims at least. There is one more Jane Doe that was found. Her legs were dumped in the marshes near Gilgo, while the rest of her body was discovered inside a suitcase that washed up in Westchester County back in 2007. She was dubbed Cherry's Doe, thanks to a tattoo on her chest. All in all, there were 11 confirmed victims of the killer, even without taking Shannan into account and another victim that we'll get into later. Besides the first 4 victims, the rest were not disposed of with use of burlap. But there was no question that Long Island had a serial killer who'd been operating since 1996, maybe even longer, and no one even realized it. They collected several hairs from the bodies. Burlap has a habit of catching fibers and embedding it in the loose weave of the fabric. The hairs were related to 2 people, one male and one female. As we later discover, Heuermann's wife's DNA matched these hairs because the car he used was driven by both of them, and he took some of the victims to his home. Some of the victims were bound with tape or belts. One of those belts had the initials WH embossed on it. You might have noticed that the initials WH doesn't match Rex Heuermann, but Rex did have a grandfather named William Heuermann. It's a circumstantial connection, I know, but the initials WH and 2 sets of unidentified DNA samples were all they had back then. So the FBI were going to try to find connections with whatever they had. So they looked into the victims and their last movements, hoping for something to shake loose. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who vanished in 2007, revealed a disturbing series of events after she was reported missing. A week after her disappearance, Maureen's 15-year-old sister, Missy, started receiving calls from the killer. He used Maureen's cell phone to make the calls, taunting Missy by telling her that her sister was dead and that he was going to watch her rot. The calls were traced to Long Island in Midtown Manhattan. Melissa Bartholomew also had a 15-year-old sister, Amanda, who got bombarded by the same calls after Melissa went missing. The calls from Melissa's phone also traced to Midtown Manhattan. Megan Waterman's final movements were caught on CCTV at a hotel where she was planning on meeting a client. Now, the cameras didn't catch the killer, but it did give investigators a time frame to trace her cell phone pings to. Her phone bounced off a tower in Long Island, only this time it was a pretty specific signal that led them to a neighborhood called Massapequa Park. Most likely the killer lived in Massapequa, Long Island, and possibly worked in Manhattan, or at least had some reason to frequent the area during the daytime. Amber Lynn Costello's disappearance also had a description that proved to be vital to the investigation. Her roommate saw the man that picked Amber up the night she went missing. He described the man as a hulking ogre, over 6 feet tall. The ogre drove a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. And the final two pieces of the puzzle were the victims' profiles and the times that they were killed. The ones who had definitive timelines to trace all disappeared during the summer. You'll understand why this is important in just a second. Lastly, they were all petite. The heaviest of them all was Tanya Jackson at 160 pounds. But if you remember, she was ex-military and very fit. Most of that was muscle. Tanya was actually a very thin woman physically. That's why Cherry's Doe is still disputed as a potential victim of the Gilgo Beach killings. She weighed around 200 pounds, putting her outside of the killer's usual victim profile that ranged between 95 and 130 pounds. Still, authorities had no one to tie these descriptions, the car, or the DNA to, so the case went stagnant, doomed to go into the Internal Hall of Fame of unsolved serial killer mysteries. Then, 11 years after the discovery of the bodies, a new task force was formed in 2022. Just 6 weeks later, they identified Rex Heuermann as a suspect for the first time. They were able to figure out that all of the victims were called from burner phones shortly before their deaths. But even better than that, all of those calls were traced to just 4 blocks in Massapequa Park. Searching 4 blocks for a Chevy Avalanche owned by a man over 6 foot tall suddenly wasn't such an impossible task anymore. Rex Heuermann came up as the only man in that 4-block radius that fit the description and who owned a Chevy Avalanche. Every time the victims' families were called and taunted by Heuermann, his personal phone pinged on the same towers at the same time that the calls were made. His phone also pinged on the same towers that the burner phones pinged on while he was making calls to the victims under the guise of eliciting their services. In other words, every call made to the victims or their families was done while Heuermann's phone was in the same area at the exact same time. He lived in Massapequa, but his architecture firm was located in Manhattan. Bingo, baby! So let's have a quick look at who Heuermann was, shall we?
Same exact workshop.
So?
I have one tool that's pretty much used in almost every job, and it's actually a cabinet maker's hammer.
Okay, cabinet maker hammer. Okay.
It is persuasive enough when I need to persuade something.
Not someone.
Something. And it always yields excellent results.
Heuermann lived with his wife, Asa, their daughter and Asa's son from her first marriage. Both kids were adults at the time of the arrest. For an architect who owned his own firm and who was doing pretty well financially, he lived in a pretty rundown house. Asa, originally from Iceland, took their kids to her home country every summer to visit family. See, I told you that their time of disappearance was going to be important. So Heuermann had enough self-control to schedule his murders during the times that his wife and children weren't home. Inside the home, they later find almost 300 firearms. Heuermann loved guns and hunting, and everyone who knew him said that it was almost all he talked about. He used burlap to wrap animals he'd hunted in, explaining his access to that particular material. At the office, the female employees reported that he was extremely critical of their bodies. If you gained a few pounds, he was going to say something about it, and he wasn't going to hide his disgust for their weight either. Ironic, since Heuermann himself was an absolute slob. He ate only fast food, never saw the inside of a gym, and looked exactly like the witness described him, like an ogre. Heuermann was a bit of a know-it-all and didn't like it if he didn't come off as the smartest, most knowledgeable person in the conversation. And he had a bit of a superiority complex. But other than that, He showed no outward signs of creepiness or violence at all. But Heuermann was very smart, very, very smart. Old school acquaintances and co-workers alike all attested that he was knowledgeable in just about every subject. Outwardly, he was shy, awkward, and kind of nerdy, but professionally, he was an absolute shark that made it his specialty to find loopholes in the law when it came to building contracts. Investigators were then able to trace the purchase of the numerous burner phones, even catching Heuermann on CCTV buying some of them. Now all they needed was that DNA match, and it would be Mr. Ogre's love for junk food that got him nailed for good. Police had been tailing him for weeks, hoping to get their hands on a sample. During lunch, Heuermann got himself an order of pizza and ate it on the go. Just before he went back to the office, he dumped the box into a trash can, and inside the box was the half-eaten crust of a slice of pizza. The DNA was a perfect match to the hair found on Megan's body. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested while out on another lunch break at the age of 59. He was initially charged with the murders of Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, since they were the ones who had his physical DNA stuck to the burlap sacks that they'd been put into. Everyone was dumbfounded. His wife, kids, the people he worked with, and the world. Never had the name Rex Heuermann ever come up. He was a nobody until the day he was arrested. The true crime community was floored. After years of forums discussing suspects, Heuermann, clunky, awkward Heuermann, was not on anyone's radar. But if anyone had any doubts before, those doubts would be shattered after the search of his home. Heuermann had a disturbing collection of content on his electronics, all of it violent, and not just against women. There were videos of kids being tortured and killed too. This video would get demonetized if I went into details, not that I'd care to discuss it anyway, but take my word for it. This was the worst kind of content out there, just awful stuff. His searches showed that he was keeping tabs on the investigation and that he was trying to locate more of the victims' families, probably to torture them even more after all these years of suffering. His activities on Craigslist, where he found the victims, were also pulled up, and then the Chevy Avalanche was taken in for evidence. Asa Heuermann was almost immediately cleared, as were the couple's children. The hairs matching Asa that were found on the victims came from the Chevy that she drove so often. It also theorized that Heuermann brought the women into his home, and there's even evidence that he kept some of them alive for several days before killing them, further explaining how Asa's hair landed on their bodies. Asa and her children were ostracized by their neighbors. Their own family won't talk to them, and both kids lost their jobs as a result of their father's sins. And they never had any idea that the man they called husband and father was a ruthless, predatory killer. People often forget that it's not just the murder victims that deserve justice. The victims' families and the fallout suffered by the killers' families are equally traumatizing. His case hasn't gone through the courts yet, simply because of the enormous amount of digital data that was taken from his home. The cell phone data and transaction records. Both sides of the argument have to comb through 120 terabytes of data, so it's going to take a while. Obviously, he pled not guilty, so this will be a drawn-out affair. Not to mention the fact that another victim's come up since the arrest, Sandra Costilla, who went missing in 1993, and her body was found 60 miles away from Gilgo Beach. Back then, there was only a single male hair found on the body and no suspects. It was only after Heuermann was arrested that Sandra was even looked into. The hair matched Heuermann, but it also made several investigators realize how extensive his crimes could possibly be. Obviously, Sandra's murder proves that Heuermann didn't just dispose of his victims at Gilgo Beach. So the search area suddenly got very, very wide, and it made it clear that he'd been killing since he was 30 years old at least. He owned property in Las Vegas and in South Carolina. There are hundreds of murdered women in those areas that could potentially fit Heuermann's MO in the nearly 30 years he's been operating. And that's just if he started at the age of 30. What about the years before that? And what about after the discovery of the bodies in 2011? There was a 12-year gap between the discovery and Heuermann's arrest. That's 12 summers of his wife going away to visit family where he probably continued killing. He'd have chosen a new dumping ground after his favorite spot was unearthed. So where'd he go to dispose of his victims in those 12 years? And how many more victims are there then? That's a chilling thought, isn't it? I doubt that he's ever going to come clean about any of his crimes. Heuermann's been tight-lipped since his arrest. The closest thing we've gotten from him was a letter he wrote to Keith Jesperson, another convicted serial killer. In that letter, Heuermann complained about his living conditions and his distaste for the stale bread he was being served. Unfortunately, writing letters to serial killers isn't exactly a smoking gun. And honestly, I have a feeling that Heuermann's too spiteful to ever give a confession, in the same way that he got satisfaction from taunting the victims' families. He's probably going to let everyone suffer by spending eternity not knowing what happened to their loved ones. That's where we stand as of now. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like an update on Heuermann's case as it goes through the courts. I've already seen a few new developments in some of the previous cases we've covered, so if you'd be interested in that, you know where to put your suggestions. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe while you're at it. It really means a lot to the team here at Evidence Obscured. You're the ones who make it all possible. See you in the next ones. Cheers.